I spent 3 years meticulously curating the life I wanted in a sleek one-bedroom apartment in the heart of Chicago. It was a space defined by glass, chrome, and a view of the skyline that felt like a reward for every sleepless night I had clocked at the agency. My best friend Sarah had been my partner in crime since our freshman year at Northwestern, so when her lease abruptly ended and her boyfriend of 5 years decided he needed to find himself in Bali, the couch was the least I could offer. She was a tornado of energy, constantly leaving her designer bags in my entryway and scenting my living room with that heavy, expensive vanilla perfume she wore. I didn't mind it at first. We were a team. I spent my days pitching campaigns to high-stakes clients and my evenings catching up with her over bottles of Pinot Noir, feeling like we were just two girls living the dream in the big city. Then came the night of the company gala. I had spent weeks prepping for this event, knowing that a promotion was on the line. I wanted to look untouchable, something that bridged the gap between professional power and undeniable confidence. I decided on a black tailored miniskirt that hit just mid-thigh, paired with sheer tights and a structured silk blazer. It felt sharp, dangerous, and perfectly fitted. I left Sarah at home, curled up in my velvet armchair with a glass of wine and her laptop, telling her to make herself at home while I went to charm the partners. The night was a whirlwind of champagne toasts, hushed negotiations, and the kind of networking that drains your soul while inflating your ego. I felt like I was winning. I felt like the girl I had always wanted to be. But the irony of the evening was that the victory tasted like ash by the time I walked out of the banquet hall at 11. A sudden, piercing migraine, the kind that feels like an ice pick behind the left eye, forced me to leave earlier than I had planned. I didn't even bother calling an Uber. I just sprinted to the valet, tipped the guy double, and focused on getting back to the quiet of my apartment. I needed the lights off, a cold compress, and the silence of my own space. As I drove through the damp Chicago streets, I was replaying the conversations I'd had, worrying about whether my skirt had been too short or if my tone had been too aggressive. I was so wrapped up in my own head, in the performance of my career, that I hadn't considered for a second that the performance in my own living room was the one that would actually matter. When I stepped off the elevator and clicked my heels down the hallway, the silence of the building felt heavy. I fumbled for my keys, my head throbbing in rhythm with my pulse. I pushed the door open, expecting to find the apartment dark, maybe with the soft glow of the television flickering against the walls. Instead, the place was pitch black, but I could hear voices. They weren't just hushed whispers. They were sharp, staccato breaths that stopped me dead in my tracks. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't make a sound. I just stood there in the entryway, my bag sliding off my shoulder and hitting the hardwood floor with a soft thud that I prayed they hadn't heard. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. There was a weird, distorted logic to what I was feeling. It wasn't suspicion. I didn't even know what I was suspicious of. It was pure, visceral dread. My brain was trying to rationalize the sounds. Maybe she was watching a movie. Maybe she was on the phone. But the rhythm was wrong. It was too physical. The moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long, jagged shadows across the living room, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. My nephew, Leo, was supposed to be in his sophomore year of college 2 hours away. He was 20, a kid who still looked like he was discovering who he was, someone I had taken under my wing when my sister went through her messy divorce. I loved him like a son. I had bought him his first suit for his internship. I was his favorite aunt, the one who gave him the cool advice and the extra cash for textbooks. Seeing him there, sprawled on my couch with Sarah, was like watching a glitch in reality. It didn't fit. It couldn't be happening. I stood there, paralyzed, wearing my corporate uniform, the blazer still buttoned tight, the miniskirt feeling suddenly like a costume in a play I hadn't realized I was starring in. I watched them, and for those few seconds, time completely dissolved. They were entangled, limbs twisted together in the low light. It wasn't the clumsy, nervous exploration of a first-time fling. It was practiced. It was a language they had been speaking behind my back for who knows how long. I felt a surge of nausea that was so strong I had to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing. I wasn't thinking about morality or betrayal in the abstract sense. I was thinking about the times I had seen them together over the past month, the way Sarah would suddenly stop talking when Leo called, the way Leo would look at me with these hollow, guilty eyes whenever I walked into the room, which I had just written off as him being a moody college kid. I had been feeding them, housing them, and essentially subsidizing their secret life while I was out there grinding for a future that suddenly looked like a hollow lie. I didn't scream. I didn't lunge. I just stood there, the weight of my own life crashing down on me. I realized in that moment that I had been blind, but more than that, I had been an accessory to my own destruction. I had invited the wolf into the house and given it the run of the place because I was so busy looking at the reflection of myself in the windows, thinking I was the protagonist of a success story. My own apartment, my own sanctuary felt violated. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf, the very air I was breathing felt tainted by the secret they were sharing. I finally managed to find my voice, though it sounded like it belonged to a stranger. It was a low, jagged whisper that barely escaped my throat. "Leo?" I said. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. They both froze, a statue of guilt caught in the silver moonlight. Sarah let out a strangled cry, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Leo didn't even try to hide. He just sat up, his hair disheveled, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of shock and an oddly cold resignation. He didn't look like the boy I knew. He looked like a man who knew he had been caught in a lie he couldn't talk his way out of. I walked toward them, my heels clicking like a ticking clock, each step feeling like I was walking toward an execution. I felt the cold air of the room biting at my skin, the contrast between my expensive professional exterior and the absolute rot happening in my living room. I reached for the light switch, and the sudden, harsh glare of the ceiling lights was blinding. Everything looked too bright, too clinical. I saw the wine glass on the coffee table, the half-eaten takeout containers, the total mess of a life that wasn't mine, but was happening in my home. Sarah started crying, but it wasn't the kind of crying that invited comfort. It was the frantic, selfish sobbing of someone who realized their comfort was about to be revoked. She started saying my name, but I couldn't hear it over the roaring in my ears. I looked at Leo, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw the arrogance behind his eyes. He wasn't sorry. He was just annoyed that the game had been interrupted. He looked at me, looked at my skirt, and his gaze lingered for a second longer than was comfortable, a look that felt like a violation all over again. I turned and walked back to the door, my entire body shaking so violently that I couldn't even get my keys out of my bag to lock up. I didn't care about the promotion. I didn't care about the gala. I didn't care about the life I had curated. I just needed to be away from the smell of that perfume and the sight of them together. I pushed the door open and walked into the hallway, the cool air of the corridor hitting my face like a slap. I didn't look back. I just started walking toward the elevator, my heart feeling like a heavy, leaden weight in my chest, wondering how I was ever going to wake up from this. I didn't take the elevator. I couldn't bear the thought of being trapped in that small, mirrored box with my own reflection. I took the stairwell, my heels echoing against the concrete like a frantic heartbeat, descending floor by floor until I hit the lobby. The night air outside was cold, the kind of Chicago wind that cuts through wool and silk alike, but I barely felt it. I just kept walking. I ended up blocks away, near a park that was mostly shadows and rustling trees, and I sat on a damp bench, the cold seeping into my skin. I didn't cry. I had moved past the point of tears, into a state of hollowed-out shock that felt almost physical, a weight sitting right behind my solar plexus. My phone vibrated in my clutch, a relentless, buzzing reminder of the world I had just stepped out of. It was Sarah, then a text from Leo, then Sarah again. They were probably in my apartment, in my bed, or standing in my living room, probably already discussing how to handle me. The thought made my skin crawl. I imagined them talking about me like I was a problem to be solved, or worse, a casualty of their real love. It was that specific, condescending pity that I knew was coming that made the bile rise in my throat again. I wanted to throw the phone into the dark bushes, to shatter the screen and break the link to everything they represented. But I didn't. I held it in my hand, staring at the screen as if the glowing names could offer some kind of explanation for the wreckage they had made of my life. I thought about the last few months, the subtle shifts I had ignored. The way Sarah would suddenly become obsessed with her phone when Leo came over for dinner, her eyes darting toward him before she'd offer a flimsy excuse to step onto the balcony. The way Leo would linger in the kitchen while I cleaned up, his presence becoming increasingly heavy, his eyes following me with a gaze that I had foolishly interpreted as him growing up and becoming more observant. I had been so narcissistic, so caught up in the optics of my own success, that I had failed to see the most basic primal signals happening right under my nose. I had been a prop in their drama, the unsuspecting aunt and the naive best friend, providing the stage for their little affair while I worked myself to the bone. The anger began to simmer then, replacing the shock. It was a cold, sharp, and entirely focused rage. It wasn't just about the act itself, it was about the audacity. They were in my house, using my resources, eating my food, and sleeping in my space, while they built this illicit connection. It was the ultimate betrayal of trust, the kind that leaves you questioning your own perception of reality. If they could do this, what else were they lying about? Were they laughing at me when I went to work? Were they mocking my ambitions, my clothes, my life, while they were curled up on my couch? The thought that my vulnerability had been their entertainment was the most agonizing part of all. I stood up and started walking back toward my apartment, not because I wanted to confront them again, but because I realized I couldn't let them win by default. I couldn't just vanish and let them have the space. I reached the lobby of my building, my face wiped clean of any emotion, my posture stiff and unnatural. The doorman gave me a questioning look as I passed, but I just kept walking, my eyes fixed on the elevator doors. I felt like a ghost in my own building. When I reached my floor, I stopped outside my door. I could hear them inside, voices raised in a muffled argument. "I told you it was a bad idea," I heard Sarah's voice, sharp and frantic. "I told you we shouldn't have been so careless." "She's just going to freak out, that's all," Leo's voice replied, sounding chillingly calm. "She'll be dramatic for a week and then she'll get over it. She always does." That was it. That was the moment the last shred of my empathy for them evaporated. They weren't just cheating, they were pathologizing me. I wasn't a person to them anymore. I was a hurdle to be cleared, a personality trait to be managed. I didn't knock. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the heavy sound of the lock clicking back like a final verdict. They both jumped, turning toward me with guilty deer-in-the-headlights expressions. The living room was exactly as I had left it, but it looked different now. It looked cheap. The lighting seemed harsh and artificial, illuminating the dust motes in the air. Sarah stood by the kitchen island, clutching her glass, her face pale and blotchy. Leo was still on the couch, looking up at me with that same infuriatingly blank stare. He hadn't even bothered to pull his shirt on properly. It was half-tucked, his posture loose and defensive. "Get out," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had a tremor of authority that stopped them both cold. "Listen," Sarah started, her voice breaking. "It's not what it looks like. We just—" "Stop," I snapped, the word cutting through the air like a blade. "Don't you dare insult me with that. Don't you dare act like this is some sort of complicated misunderstanding. I saw you. I heard you. I know exactly what this is. You're both parasites." Leo stood up then, his face hardening. "Look, Auntie, don't start with the dramatic act. We're adults. We didn't think you'd be home so early, and we didn't think it would be such a big deal if you did find out. Things happen." I stared at him, unable to fathom how a person could be this hollow. "Things happen?" I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "You're my nephew. You're the child of my own sister. And you, Sarah, you've been my best friend for years. You know my secrets, my fears, everything. And you chose to do this here, in my home?" Sarah looked down at the floor, her shoulders slumped. It just started, okay? It wasn't planned. It was just one night, and then it became something else." "It doesn't matter how it started," I said, stepping further into the room. "It matters that you continued it. It matters that you looked me in the eye every single day and lied to me. I don't want to hear about feelings or accidents. I want you both gone, now. If you aren't out of this apartment by sunrise, I will tell everyone. I will call my sister, I will call your parents, and I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of people you are." Sarah looked terrified, but Leo just narrowed his eyes. "You're really going to be that person? You're going to blow up your own family over a mistake? That's pretty low, even for you." "Don't you dare talk to me about low," I hissed, taking a step toward him. "You have no idea what low is. You are living in a dream world where your selfishness is justified by your desires, but the real world is going to come crashing down on you, and I am not going to be the one holding you up." The tension in the room was so thick you could taste it, a metallic tang of resentment and fear. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was disgusted. I saw them for what they were: shallow, entitled people who thought the world revolved around their impulses. I watched as they slowly started to collect their things, Sarah crying, Leo pacing with a scowl on his face. I didn't help them. I didn't offer a bag. I just stood in the center of the room, guarding the space that they had so callously invaded. As they packed, I realized that this wasn't just about the betrayal of a partner or a friend. It was about the realization that the people I thought were the bedrock of my life were nothing more than shifting sand. I had been building my house on a foundation of lies, and now that the storm had hit, there was nothing left but the wreckage. When they finally walked out the door, the silence that rushed back into the apartment was deafening. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a home. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a tomb. I walked over to the spot on the couch where they had been sitting and stared at it for a long time. I felt like I needed to scrub the entire apartment with bleach, to burn the couch, to tear out the floors and start over from scratch. But I knew that wouldn't change anything. The memory of them, the image of them tangled together in the moonlight, was etched into my brain now. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a drink, not to celebrate, but to numb the sharp, jagged edges of the reality I now had to inhabit. I sat in the dark, watching the city lights blink outside, feeling like a stranger in my own life. I had won the argument, I had kicked them out, and I had maintained my boundaries, but I had never felt more defeated in my entire life. The victory was hollow, and the future was a vast, terrifying expanse of uncertainty. I didn't know what I was going to do tomorrow, or the day after that. I only knew that the person I had been when I walked out that morning was dead, and I had no idea who was going to take her place. The sunrise was a cruel, clinical light that did nothing to soften the jagged edges of my reality. I had spent the night awake, sitting on the balcony with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the city wake up, as if it were a process I no longer belonged to. The city moved on, oblivious to the fact that my entire world had been gutted. By the time the sun fully breached the horizon, I felt less like a person and more like a collection of raw nerves. My phone was a silent, vibrating brick on the patio table. Dozens of messages from Sarah, then a string of cold, defensive texts from Leo. I didn't read them. I didn't have to. I could hear the tone of them in my head, the justifications, the attempts to shift the blame, the classic manipulation of someone who thinks their feelings are an excuse for moral bankruptcy. I finally walked inside and threw the phone into a kitchen drawer. The apartment felt like a crime scene, each corner whispering reminders of the betrayal. I started with the couch. I grabbed the cushions, the throw blankets, the accent pillows, and dragged them to the trash chute in the hallway. It was an impulsive, irrational act, but it felt necessary. I needed to excise them from my space. Then I went through the cabinets, pulling out every remnant of Sarah, her skincare products, that ridiculous oversized robe she insisted on leaving in my bathroom, the stacks of magazines she'd piled up on the coffee table. I didn't care about the value of the items. I just wanted them gone. By mid-morning, the apartment was half empty, a hollow shell that reflected my own internal state. The real challenge was facing the day. I had a meeting at 10, a major presentation that would dictate the next 6 months of my career. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to conjure the woman who had walked out the door the previous night, the woman in the miniskirt, the woman who believed in the power of her own ambition. She was gone. In her place was a hollowed-out version of me, eyes rimmed with red, skin pale and translucent. I applied layers of concealer, masked the exhaustion with a sharp red lipstick, and forced myself into a crisp gray suit. I looked the part, but the armor felt flimsy. I was terrified that someone, anyone, would look at me and see the cracks. The office was a frantic buzz of activity. I navigated the hallways on autopilot, nodding at colleagues, exchanging small talk that felt like a foreign language. Nobody noticed. That was the most jarring part. The world continued to operate as if nothing had changed. My boss, a man who saw humans as line items in a spreadsheet, didn't ask why I looked like I hadn't slept for a week. He just wanted to know if the slides were ready. I gave the presentation, and to my surprise, I was brilliant. It was a cold, detached kind of brilliance, the kind that comes when you no longer care about the outcome. I didn't care if I got the promotion. I didn't care about the success. The indifference made me even more effective. I laid out the strategy with a precision that was almost surgical, and by the time I sat down, I had secured the contract. But the moment I left the office, the adrenaline crashed. I found myself in my car, parked in the garage, unable to start the engine. I just sat there, staring at the windshield, waiting for the weight to lift. It didn't. Instead, it grew heavier. My sister, Leo's mother, called. I ignored it. Then she called again, and a third time. I knew what she wanted. Leo had already gotten to her. He had probably framed it as his crazy, uptight aunt overreacting to a harmless mistake. The level of manipulation they were capable of was breathtaking. I felt a surge of rage, so intense it made my vision blur. They were going to rewrite the narrative. They were going to make me the villain, because that was the only way they could live with themselves. I finally picked up the phone. Her voice was thin, nervous.
সাগরের ঢেউ দেখিয়া নাই মন সাগরে নানা মিলে সাধন ভজন সকলি যাই বিফলে গো সকলি যাই বিফলে ওরে রূপ সাগরের ঢেউ দেখিয়া নাই মন সাগরে নানা মিলে সাধন ভজন সকলি যাই বিফলে গো সকলি যাই বিফলে আহা সাগরের দুই মোহনা একটি আশায় একটি যাওয়া সাধক যারা নাই মোতারা সাধক যাহারা নাই মোতারা সাধক যারা নাই মোতারা সাধক সারা যায় ডুবে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে সাগরের খাইছো ননি আসিয়া এই ববেতে ওরে আরেক সাগরটাকে তোমায় নিতে তার মোহনাতে গো নিতে তার মোহনাতে ও এক সাগরের খাইছো ননি আসিয়া এই ববেতে আরেক সাগরটাকে তোমায় নিতে তার মোহনাতে গো নিতে তার মোহনাতে ওরে মোহনাতে জুয়ার বাটা মোহনাতে জুয়ার বাটা না জানিয়া যাব দিলে মন মরবি অকালে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে সাগরের সাধক যারা তারা নাইমা সাগরে আরে এক চুমুকে শুকাই পানি ডুবার বইতার না থাকে গো, ডুবার বইতার না থাকে। ওরে রূপসাগরের সাধক যারা তারা নাইমা সাগরে, এক চুমুকে শুকাই পানি ডুবার বইতার না থাকে গো, ডুবার বইতার না থাকে। ওরে জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা, জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা, জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা, জুয়ার আসলে যাই ডুবে। রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে, রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে, রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে, রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে।
She didn't lead with the truth. She danced around it, asking how I was, asking why Leo was acting so weird, asking if there had been some kind of misunderstanding at my place. I could hear his influence in every word she spoke. My sister had always been a peacekeeper, someone who avoided confrontation at any cost, and Leo knew how to use that against her. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady, and I told her the truth. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told her that I had caught them together. I told her that I had kicked them out. I told her that I was done. Her silence on the other end was a heavy, suffocating thing. She didn't explode. She didn't defend him. She just collapsed. The sound of her weeping, a quiet, broken, defeated sound, was far worse than any argument. It shattered the last bit of resolve I had. I realized then that the damage wasn't contained to my apartment. It had spilled out into the family, infecting the very connections that were supposed to be safe. My sister began to apologize, not for herself, but for her son, and that was the moment I finally broke. I sat in my car, in the middle of a concrete parking garage, and I sobbed. I sobbed for the betrayal, for the loss of my best friend, for the corruption of a kid I had loved like my own, and for the sheer, unfair weight of a situation I hadn't asked for. I hung up, exhausted, and finally drove home. The city felt different now. Everything looked sharper, colder, more defined. I wasn't the same person who had entered that apartment yesterday, and I never would be again. I walked into my home and found a box sitting in the middle of the floor. It was from Sarah. I didn't open it. I knew exactly what it was, her way of trying to frame the narrative, a note of apology, a plea to talk, some object that represented us in a way that felt manipulative and calculated. I took the box, unopened, and threw it into the trash with the rest of her things. I was done with the apologies. I was done with the excuses. I was done with the versions of my life that were built on the shaky foundations of other people's desires. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. They were just as bright as they had been the night before, but they no longer felt like a goal. They felt like a distraction. I realized that for all my planning, for all my obsession with my career and my image, I had been profoundly lonely. I had surrounded myself with people who didn't actually see me, who only saw what I could do for them. Sarah had been a passenger, someone who rode the coattails of my life because she didn't have the discipline to create her own. Leo had been a project, someone I was trying to mentor because I wanted the feeling of being a guide, of being important. I had been playing a role, and they had been playing a part, and none of it was real. I thought about the miniskirt, the dress I had worn the night I found them. It seemed like such a trivial thing now, a costume for a life I was no longer interested in leading. I wondered if I could ever go back to being that woman, the one who cared about the optics, the one who worried about being perceived as cool or successful. The idea felt exhausting. I wanted something else. I wanted something genuine. I wanted to build a life that didn't depend on the approval of people who could turn on me at a moment's notice. I realized that the hardest part of the betrayal wasn't what they had done to me, it was what they had forced me to see about myself. I had been complicit in my own isolation. I had let them in because I was afraid of being alone, and in the end, that fear was exactly what had been used to destroy me. I turned away from the window, the darkness of the room now feeling not like a void, but like a blank canvas. The aftermath didn't come in a dramatic explosion or a final cinematic showdown. It came in the quiet, agonizing erosion of the status quo. In the weeks that followed, the silence in my apartment became my only roommate. It wasn't the kind of peace I had imagined for myself. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that filled the rooms where laughter, wine, and secrets used to live. I stopped caring about the decor. I stopped caring about the view. I spent my evenings sitting in the dark, not because I was sad, but because the light felt like a demand I couldn't meet. I had been forced to dismantle a version of myself that had spent years in the making, and the reconstruction process was proving to be far more brutal than I had anticipated. The fallout with my family was the slow-motion car crash I had anticipated. My sister didn't talk to me for weeks, caught in the middle of a war she didn't want to fight. Leo, true to form, had doubled down on his narrative, claiming I had been suffocating and controlling, and that his relationship with Sarah was a natural byproduct of the environment I had created. It was the ultimate gaslight, a masterclass in projection. He was painting himself as a victim of my expectations, and Sarah was right there with him, whispering her version of the story to anyone who would listen. I found out through mutual acquaintances that they had moved in together into a small, cramped apartment across town. The thought of them playing house in some dingy, forgotten corner of the city didn't give me satisfaction. It just felt pathetic. They were two people bound together by a shared dishonesty, and eventually they would do to each other exactly what they had done to me. I didn't need revenge. I realized that their existence was the punishment. I went to work, but I was a shell. I finished the project, I got the promotion, and I sat in my new, larger office looking out at a different part of the Chicago skyline. The accolades felt distant, like praise meant for someone else. I realized that my ambition had been a distraction, a way to fill the void of a life that lacked real, authentic connections. I had wanted to be the woman who had it all, the career, the style, the social circle, the perfect curated life. But that woman had been an empty vessel. She was built for the gaze of others, and when the people I relied on to maintain that gaze turned their back, the whole structure collapsed. I wasn't just grieving a friend and a nephew. I was grieving the illusion that I was somehow special, somehow immune to the basic messiness of human nature. One Saturday afternoon, I went through the last of the things they had left behind. In a shoebox pushed to the back of the pantry, I found an old photo of the three of us, Sarah, Leo, and me, taken a year ago at a winery. We were laughing, caught in a moment of genuine, unburdened joy. Looking at it now, I could see the cracks that I had been too blind to notice, the way Sarah was angled toward Leo, the way his hand rested on the back of my chair, but his eyes were fixed on her. It was all there, in plain sight, a map of the betrayal I was too arrogant to read. I held the photo for a long time, the paper smooth and cold under my thumb. Then I didn't rip it up. I didn't throw it in the trash. I tucked it back into the box and put it in the back of my closet. It wasn't a keepsake. It was a reminder, a permanent physical warning against the arrogance of believing that you know the people you love. I began to change, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I started spending my time in ways that felt honest. I took up long, aimless walks through the city, observing the real lives happening on the sidewalks, the struggling artists, the weary commuters, the people who were just trying to exist without the need for an audience. I started reading books that challenged me, listening to music that was raw and unpolished, and stripping away the expensive, performative layers of my life. I sold the designer furniture, donated the clothes that felt too much like a costume, and bought a simple, sturdy wooden table that didn't care if I ate takeout on it or if I sat at it alone for hours in the dark. The final realization came on a Tuesday, exactly 3 months after that night. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when I realized that I hadn't thought about them in 24 hours. The sharp, burning anger had faded into a dull, manageable ache, a scar that reminded me of what I had survived rather than what I had lost. I had stopped waiting for an apology. I had stopped looking for a reason. I accepted that they were just people, deeply flawed, selfish, and desperate people, and that their actions were a reflection of their own brokenness, not my worth. I was not the cause of their betrayal, and I was not the victim of a grand, tragic conspiracy. I was just someone who had been hit by the reality of how fickle and fragile the human heart can be. I walked out to the balcony, the Chicago air hitting me with the familiar, biting cold. I looked out at the skyline, the same one I had spent years trying to conquer, and for the first time, it didn't look like a challenge. It looked like a backdrop, an infinite, shifting, beautiful mess of millions of lives, each one hiding its own secrets, its own betrayals, and its own quiet, personal resurrections. I wasn't the protagonist of a viral story anymore. I was just a woman, standing on her balcony, breathing in the city, ready to start a day that belonged entirely to me. I had lost the people I thought were my everything, but in the process, I had finally found the one person I had neglected all along, myself. And as I turned back into my quiet, empty, and perfectly honest home, I knew that was enough. It was more than enough. I was finally, truly, and terrifyingly free.
কার বাসরে ঘুমাও তুমি, কার নিয়ে চলো, আমায় রেখে কেন প্রিয়া গিয়াছ রে বলো। কার বাসরে ঘুমাও তুমি, কার নিয়ে চলো, আমায় রেখে কেন প্রিয়া গিয়াছ রে বলো। কার মনেতে তোমার আশা রাখো জমা করে, আমার আশা পুইরা দিয়া তুমি রইলা দূরে। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। আসলে ভালো বললে রে তুই আশাগুলো দিয়ে, চইলা গেলে কষ্ট দিয়া নতুন সাথী নিয়ে। বাসলে ভালো বললে রে তুই আশাগুলো দিয়ে, চইলা গেলে কষ্ট দিয়া নতুন সাথী নিয়ে। তোর প্রেমেরই মন্ত্র ছিল অভিনয়ের জাল, তোর কথা বিশ্বাস কইরা হইল আমার কাল। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। কার মনেতে বাসা বাঁধো আমায় রেখে রে, কার মুখেতে ফুটাও হাসি আমায় কাঁদিয়ে। কার মনেতে বাসা বাঁধো আমায় রেখে রে, কার মুখেতে ফুটাও হাসি আমায় কাঁদিয়ে। স্বার্থ নিয়া করলে খেলায় আমার সাথে রে, পর ভাবিয়া দূরে গেলে আমায় রেখে রে। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী সুর।